This is Sarah Lacey.
And this is Paul Carr. And Sarah, where are we today?
We're in Berlin.
What on earth are we doing here?
Well, I have an actual reason. I was speaking at the Next 11 conference about my book, and you were in London and had just finished the launch for your new book. So I convinced you to hop over here and explore Berlin with me.
And indeed we have. We spent the whole day yesterday walking around the city, despite Sarah's heavily pregnant, as I believe somebody tweeted.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that Sarah's about 23 months pregnant now. We walked around the city for 3 hours. And what was your highlight, Sarah? What have you learned about Berlin?
Well, the highlight of the walking tour was, I think the highlight of the walking tour was seeing getting an appreciation that Berlin is sort of a startup city.
Yeah.
I think on the one hand, I tend to like very old cities, and it's somewhat sad that there's not a lot of old buildings. There's not, a lot.
Well, they're knocking down all the old buildings because of the sad history.
Knocked them down. I mean, that's part of it as well.
Sorry, that was my fault.
That having been said, you get this appreciation of one reason that Berlin feels like a very different city than other Western Europe is it's not so trapped in the past, which is interesting.
Yeah.
What about you? What was your highlight?
No, my highlight was the same. I kind of like the fact that in 20 years, however long it's been since the wall was knocked down. What?
We are literally only looking at your nose and eyes.
Oh, really? It's quite hard to do this. Hang on, maybe I should hand it to you at this point. You can film me. No, I like the idea that in 20 years it's turned from being so where we're staying in Weinmeisterstrasse, which is Mitte, is used to be the Soviet, the sort of East German section, and in 20 years it's managed to turn into this. I mean, we're here in this courtyard that's. I think our guide said this was like the old Jewish sector, right? Yeah,
but that's what I was going to say. Even before it was the Soviet sector, it was the old Jewish sector. So it's a lot of history has happened.
And it's become not much of it good, and it's become very gentrified very quickly. And
it's very artsy, and it's really a microcosm for what excites people about Berlin.
So let's talk. You said then it's a great place, the startup atmosphere. We had an interesting conversation earlier where you said if you were going to start a European startup now, whereas maybe before you came here, we just assumed London is the logical place to do it, for all its flaws. You now think Berlin.
Well, I was saying if we did a Disrupt conference, I would rather do it in Berlin than in London.
But you also said it would be a better place to do a startup, or the startups you had spoken to.
No, I talked to a startup this morning who had said that it was a company, and they were started in Boston, by a German guy, and got funding in the Valley. And it was interesting because the Valley people actually told him, there's no point in being in Boston because you're going to have to pay a lot for mediocre developers, which isn't surprising. A lot of Valley people would say that. But what they said was you should either move to the Valley or Berlin. And so I was asking the guy, well, how would you compare and contrast London, Berlin? And he looked kind of stumped, and he said, until you brought it up, we actually never even considered London as an option for where to do the startup. And I mean, that surprised me. I don't think you would have heard that a couple years ago.
Well, it's sort of become this truism almost, as my nose is probably saying to the camera now. But it's become this sort of truism that London is the logical place for an American startup to go to enter Europe because of the language and because there's a proximity thing as well.
If we run into one person who doesn't speak English here?
No, not
I
yet.
don't see language being an issue.
No, exactly. Everybody speaks English here. No, but just in terms of it's also closer, perhaps culturally, to America in the UK. The UK is than perhaps Germany is. But maybe that's the point. If you're going to move to a European market, then maybe you don't want somewhere that's so culturally aligned.
You have to distill the difference between Germany and Berlin. I mean, I think Berlin is very different from what I've heard from the rest of Germany. So, I don't see a big difference culturally between. Let me rephrase that. I do see a big difference culturally between London and Berlin, but I don't see it in terms of country. I see it in terms of city. I think London is really an analog to New York, and I think Berlin is much more of an analog to San Francisco.
It isn't amazing. There's a very artsy scene. The one big difference between here and San Francisco is the rents here.
And it's still on.
I just want to look at you for a little longer here. Good point. But one, this is why we normally have a team of people. One of the differences is that it's cheaper here considerably. There is the same artsy, cultural, techie vibe here.
Disrupt conference here. London.
Our hotel was pretty cheap compared to.
It is everything about it, and it's easier. It is an easier city to get around in. It's cheaper, and the thing that I think is similar to San Francisco is most of the people we've met here kind of it's a very it's a city full of transplants like San Francisco is, and most of the people were pulled here because they didn't quite fit where they were at home. There's a lot of people kind of, you see it in the fashion sense walking the street, you see it in the art scene, you see it, in a lot of things, that it's a lot of people doing their own thing, which is, what was like the early days of Silicon Valley. So I mean, I'm not saying like a Silicon Valley is going to develop, because, German startups so far really have the reputation for being even more copycats than Chinese startups do. So I think there's little evidence that there's something right now that's happening that's more tangible to Europe. But I think it's easier to make the case because of the cost of living, because of the creative class, because of a willingness to experiment and take risks and not get freaked out about the repercussions. And also because I think it's, a lot of the coding talent is really in Eastern Europe, and it's much more of a gateway between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And from what I understand, if you're a coder, that fits under, skills Germany needs, and immigration is incredibly easy to move someone here.
Well, Germany is also part of, obviously, it's me talking now. Germany obviously being part of the European Union, there's a lot of places where you don't even need a visa, where you can just, there's freedom of movement. And also, between here and London, between here and Paris, between here and parts of Eastern Europe as well.
Right, and I understand they don't have as restrictive labor laws as Paris, which is another big
that is also my understanding, but I've never actually employed anyone here, so I don't know. No, I have to say, and I'm from London. I have to say, being from London, I still would think if I were doing a startup, I might almost consider being here, partly because of the rents, but just because there is more of a vibe of like, this is an exciting place, interesting things that happen. When I was back in London,
it's dynamic.
It's right, and that dynamism seems to be, it's not absent from London. London's still an amazing city, but it's definitely not that same. Silicon Roundabout that everyone was talking about, it peaked for a while. People were enthusiastic again, but now everybody kind of just rolls their eyes. Even the people based there or talk about it are kind of rolling their eyes, and the novelty has gone. Whereas here, there does seem to be a real sense of things are happening. It's exciting again.
I mean, you talk about a lot wanting to get away from the cynicism in London. I thought that Germans generally would be pretty cynical, but it doesn't feel that way walking around the city. I mean, we're sort of in the very young, hip, artsy district. Maybe we're getting a skewed view of it.
Also, our guide was but to the point where there was a huge amount of Germans here, obviously, but it's also our guide was Spanish yesterday, and there were people of all nationalities, and I think much like London, it's influenced very much by the people who are here, many of whom aren't German, but also I think it's kind of a misconception that and maybe a generational thing that the Germans are much more sort of efficient and humorless and unenthusiastic. I don't think that's the case now. It certainly isn't in Berlin. So you think disrupt Berlin on the cards? New York, Beijing, Berlin.
I think within the next 5 years we do disrupt in Berlin. If we rotate the international one, if the China one goes great, we may never rotate it from China. But if we were to do a rotating international one, and we wanted to do one in Europe, I would argue for Berlin, because I was much more interested in doing one somewhere that would really pull the Eastern European coding talent, because I think the hackathons are really the most interesting part of the international disrupts. I think the hackathon's going to be the most interesting part of the one in China, and I think Valley companies that are going to come to that, the feedback I've been getting is they want to see the sheer hacking talent in China. They want these people building on their platforms. And I think you're going to see the same thing if we did one in Europe. So to me, you don't do a lot by having it in London. You have it somewhere like this, where it's easy, it's still a hub, it's cheap, it's a place maybe people haven't been to as much as London. I don't know, it makes more sense to me. I'm sure we'll get hate mail, but it makes more sense to me.
Well, fortunately, we won't be able to understand a lot of it it's from other parts of Europe.
I think the other reason that I've really enjoyed Berlin, frankly, is, when you spend 40 weeks in emerging markets, any Western city is just so easy.
This was even the underground,
so
getting
easy.
around is, Well, in that case, join us in the next 5 years, hopefully, for Disrupt Berlin. And
maybe next week for Wisest News.
And join us next week for Wisest News New York, probably. We'll be at Disrupt.
We might be so sick of each other by then we skip a show, though.
I already can't be bothered to even,
You can't be bothered to even aim the camera.
I know, exactly. I'm bored of myself, clearly. I was like, my nose will do. Join us next week on Wisest News.